Okay, well that seems to work. The the bell anyway. So thanks for your attention. We're going to proceed with the program now. We've got a great couple of events here, and we don't want to keep you until too late tonight. So it's a sensitive, it's a work night, and people got to go to work tomorrow. So we're really wonderfully, there are benefit tonight to have with us Admiral Richardson, who's going to come up and introduce Eilert Carlson, our guest speaker. We thank Admiral Richardson for coming. His bio is exceptional. He's been a squadron commander, submarine commander, group commander, and soon to be the next CNO. So with that, please help me welcome Admiral John Richardson.
All right, well, thank you all very much, and it's just such a terrific night to be together. We were just talking at our table, over the 13 years that we've been celebrating the Battle of Midway in this manner, if you go back 13 years, and there were a few people that were there at that very first dinner, where it was really just sort of a couple folks on the Navy Yard starting to get this ball rolling. And, I think that you're saying they all fit on one long table, sort of gathered there and said, okay, well, this feels about right. And from those sort of humble beginnings to come to where we are right now, where I think literally, I truly start to feel this rhythm that, hey, is June rolling around? Well, it's about time to be thinking about Midway. What book can I read about Midway to kind of get into that flow and commemorate this terrific event that changed the course of history. And I will tell you that perhaps no greater tribute to the battle itself was paid by the really eminent British historian John Keegan, who, they've got Trafalgar, right? And so they've got Trafalgar Night and all of that, but this very highly regarded historian said that of all the naval battles in all of history, the greatest and most decisive battle was the Battle of Midway, which is high praise indeed from a British historian. So it just gives you a sense. I just want to extend welcome to everybody on behalf of Admiral Greenert, the Chief of Naval Operations, who I'm privileged to represent tonight, and to welcome you all here. Admiral Rob, you and the team of teams that come together to bring this and make this happen have done, again, just a spectacular job. And I know it's a year-long effort each year. As soon as we finish tonight, you're going to find some reason to get together and share a cocktail and get started on the planning for the next year. But I think for Admiral Rob and the whole team that brought this event together, let's give a nice round of applause. And so if I could just take a few minutes to tee up our guest speaker, and I won't keep you too long. It is sort of a nice time in June to start to think about everything that happened during that epical time in history where truly history and our nation's existence, indeed the existence of the free world, was in the balance. And, June is kind of a sweet spot, if you will, with so many things that happened. In 42, of course, we're here to celebrate Midway, but also, D-Day and the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and so many of our, pivotal, epical events in World War II, particularly for our Navy, happened here in June. We were talking, so many of us got married in June because we graduated, right? Graduated. Any D-Day marriages in town? If you're married on the 6th of June, okay, wouldn't surprise. And so, it's just sort of a great month to sit down and think about so many important things in our lives and in our history. And it's perfectly appropriate, I think, that we just take a moment to pause get out dressed up in our finery and celebrate this battle. And the thing that I would just sort of, the thing that hits me every time I think about Midway and so many other battles, when you really do the proper you read the proper histories, I guess, is that it really is just a battle of inches. It is a battle of everybody struggling to do that one more step. And it's completely disconnected too. You just don't know what is going to be that thing that makes the difference. And if you just think about the main narrative thread of the Battle of Midway, it starts, perhaps, it starts well before, but let's pick it up just with USS Nautilus. And, we've got Chief here from the Nautilus, and he was telling us about this last night on Capitol Hill, where, Nautilus is out there, the only submarine in this joint action, right? So if you think about Coral Sea and Midway, it's really kind of the first times that we operated as a truly integrated joint Navy. And so here's USS Nautilus out there, and they get in the mix of all this thing. They see the Shido Buntai come over the horizon and, of course, engage, right? That's what we're all going to do. And Chief will tell you much better than I, Nautilus was no spring chicken when she went to sea on that very first war patrol. She was already, I think, over 12 or so years old at the time, but nonetheless, engaged the enemy, and so she did. And her CO, Commander Brockman, did that, and got tangled up with the one of the Japanese destroyers, and they just kind of went at it, trading punches back and forth, torpedo here, bunch of depth charges there. Meanwhile, the main group is sailing on towards Midway, and it just turns out that I think neither the destroyer nor, thank God, Nautilus was lost in that engagement, but by virtue of that tangle up, the destroyer Arashi found herself, behind, right? So her main carrier group had left. And so now it's time for this destroyer to disengage with Nautilus and time to catch up, right? So she just takes off at a head flank, making a beeline for the rest of the main group, okay? So here it is, just one submarine doing what they're sort of paid to do, engaging the enemy, ends up just this knife fight, between two ships. No ships lost, and now the destroyer's off to rejoin the main group. Now, from undersea to up in the sky now, right? VB6 and Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. And here he is, right? The rest of his group has gone back, right? They're getting low on fuel. The rest of the team goes back. Commander McCluskey decides he's going to go just that extra inch. He's going to stay on the job. And just as he's about to run out of fuel, he looks down, spots the very destroyer that was tangled up with Nautilus, and she is making a beeline directly towards the strike group. He just says, okay, I'm going to follow that arrow, and goes forward, and the rest is history. He was the one, Commander McCluskey, who made the initial detection and radioed it back, and that was the real start, right? It's a much different world back then. Just finding the enemy was a major part of the engagement. And so, then it goes on. We have some of our vets served on Yorktown, right? And again, Yorktown is another example of people just doing their very best. They have no idea of the sense or the place that they're going to play in history. But here is the team on Yorktown. Yorktown took severe damage in the Battle of Coral Sea, was going to go back for a year or more of an upkeep, pulls up in Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard turns her around in days, miraculously. She goes back on. She's in the fight. right? The Japanese carriers who were also who took damage in that were not, right? So this is sort of American ingenuity, get to it and make it happen, already starting to play a factor in the war. Even during the engagement, Yorktown takes major damage in the Battle of Midway, but the damage control efforts are so effective that she just stays in the fight. As a result of that, the Japanese completely lose situational awareness of how many carriers really have been lost, damaged, etc. They take credit for sinking 2 carriers when it was Yorktown the whole time, right? And Yorktown did not go down at first. It came back, fixed herself, got back up to speed, launching and recovering aircraft. Again, each person doing their job, and all of those inches adding up to this amazing victory in the Pacific, which again was so decisive in turning the course of the war in the Pacific, which at the time was still a holding action, right? We were still kind of in a Germany first posture, and so even more miraculous that as a holding action we could pull off a result like this. So it is this game of inches, this game of just the perseverance, the determination of the American sailor that just would not stop. And so while we can talk about technology, we can talk about all of those things, this is a tribute to the determination and perseverance of the American sailor. We are privileged tonight to have 6 of those sailors with us today who serve more than anything else as just such a stunning example and inspiration for what all of these inches add up to make this stunning victory. And so I think if we could just now give them a real proper recognition of our admiration, the debt of gratitude that we pay them, and give them all another round of applause. Thank you. So to all of you who were at the battle, the 6 of you who joined us tonight, thank you so much. More than anything else, you show us exactly what right looks like, how we should proceed as we day to day go through our business, just giving our very best, because we do not ever know what is going to matter at the end of the day. That one last inch that we struggled for could be, in fact, the very decisive event. Now I'll tell you, we are privileged tonight. I talked about reading good histories. And in my opinion, I dabble in history. I'm by no means a professional, but a good historical account will bring you back as much as possible into the day about which it's talking, right? So it'll bring you back there, and it'll try and immerse you into all of the uncertainty and all of the things that were at play at the time, right? Because by no means was this a fait accompli. It was not destined to happen by any stretch of the imagination. We talk about this game of inches, and nowhere is this idea more manifest than it is in cryptology and cryptanalysis, where they are literally grabbing for straws, little bits of information, and just sort of piling them up. And you never know exactly what that last little piece is going to be that will suddenly bring it all together, allow you to break the code, allow you to piece together the message, allow you to understand what is going on. And Joe Rochefort was just a tremendously unique character. Studied for several years in Japan, right? I think a message for all of us now in terms of how powerful that sort of international engagement can be, fiercely independent, not quite always as diplomatic as many might have liked, but there's this combination of personality, skills, perseverance, independence that made him so successful, the person to be at the exact right time in history to help us through this battle. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Imitation Game, which is about the effort in England at Bletchley Park and Alan Turing as they broke the Enigma codes. And it gives you a sense for just how exciting, but how intellectual and how different that part of the contribution to the war was, but yet so vital, right? We would not have had a Midway if we hadn't had insight into the Japanese planning that came from breaking those codes. There is no better history than Rochefort's War. It meets John Richardson's criteria in every sense for just a terrific historical novel. It brings you back to those times, and you are literally, you feel, what was at stake. You feel the uncertainty. You feel all of those decisions that had to be made in that uncertain environment. The book has won pretty much every single award that a historical novel can win. The Samuel Eliot Morison Book Award for Naval Literature. When you get an award named after Samuel Eliot Morison, you know you've done some pretty serious naval history, right? The John Lyman book for the best naval biography, the Theodore and Franklin D. Roosevelt Naval History Prize, and several others. I will tell you that you will probably get no better picture of how that a person's life led to such a pivotal contribution. You will never get a better picture for how scrapping for every inch can add up to make the pivotal and decisive difference. We are privileged tonight to have the author of that book join us. So I wish, join me please in welcoming our guest speaker tonight, the author of Rochefort's War, Mr. Elliot Carson. Mr. Carson. Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Cheat notes. After that, I should quit right now. Thank you very much for that excellent, wonderful introduction. I must apologize to you tonight. I'm a little hoarse, but I'm okay. And if you'll stick with me, I think I'll be okay. But I will be drinking some water from time to time. Admiral Richardson, distinguished guests, and especially the veterans of the battle in the Midway. I'm greatly honored to have been invited to talk to you tonight about this milestone in U.S. naval history. This happens to be a year of important anniversaries. 2015 marks the 70th year since the end of World War II. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. And 3 months later, on August 15, Emperor Hirohito made his famous broadcast in which he announced Japan's capitulation. Hirohito's broadcast had very definite roots in my topic tonight, code breaking and Midway. 73 years after that historic engagement, the two words are practically synonymous. And it's obvious to see why. To borrow a phrase from another historian, Midway is one of those cases when intelligence strikes like lightning. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the Midway campaign was probably the only battle, other than the Battle of the Coral Sea, in which code breaking was fundamental to the event. That is to say, if there had been no code breaking, the battle would not have happened. More agonizing years of combat loomed ahead, but the tide of war had turned. Quote, Midway was the critical battle of the Pacific War, Nimitz said. That engagement made everything else possible. Even the Army's chief of staff, the dour and grimly taciturn General George Marshall, was impressed. Marshall said, the closest squeak and the greatest victory in the Pacific War was at Midway. As factors in that victory, he cited the magnificent and self-sacrificing performance of the American Navy. Now, Marshall's appraisal of Midway is now widely accepted. What is less well known, and the story I plan to tell tonight, is that lightning almost didn't strike on June 4. The Battle of Midway almost didn't happen. As Marshall said, Midway was a close squeak, but it wasn't only a close squeak in the action near Midway. It was also a close squeak in Washington, where during the second and third weeks of May, the leaders of the Army and Navy couldn't agree on where Yamamoto would strike. For a time, Nimitz remained unfazed by this squabble. He felt comfortable because on May 13, he had received a critical piece of intelligence that disclosed to his satisfaction what Yamamoto intended to do. That crucial intel derived from a source Nimitz had learned to trust. That source was a prickly and sometimes difficult intelligence officer named Joe Rochefort. Nimitz's faith in Rochefort was well placed. This was an unusual officer. He had been one of the pioneers in Navy cryptology, albeit quite by accident. While serving aboard a tanker in the 1920s, he astonished his superiors by his prowess at puzzle solving and, of all things, contract bridge. They were so impressed by his ability at these things that they helped bring about his transfer to the Navy Department for training in a new program that started in cryptanalysis. Rochefort arrived in Washington in 1925. At age 25, assigned to something called the research desk. That was a euphemism intended to camouflage the Navy's newest and one of its most secret activities, code breaking. Running this desk was a gifted, if eccentric, young lieutenant named Lawrence Safford. Safford, a year earlier, had founded the research desk and launched the Navy into the esoteric world of codes and ciphers. Rochefort was his star pupil. But officers needed time at sea to advance their careers, and Safford was no exception. Rochefort had hardly arrived in Washington when Safford was gone, rotated to sea duty. So, in an amazing twist of fate, Rochefort inherited his job. 4 months after arriving, Rochefort was put in charge of the Navy's recently created code-breaking arm. All at once, he was running a small group consisting of one officer himself and a couple of civilians, maybe 4 civilians, and one of those civilians was the brilliant and somewhat haughty Agnes Meyer Driscoll. She was known as Miss Aggie. Now, Miss Aggie trained Joe in the new field of cryptanalysis, and together they accomplished quite a bit. For one thing, they solved the Imperial Navy's main code, then called the Red Code. They happen to have a copy of the Red Code on hand because of some extraordinary daring do by the Office of Naval Intelligence. In 1923, Navy sleuths broke into the Japanese consulate in New York, cracked the safe there, and photographed the Navy Code. That probably couldn't happen today. So, thanks to ONI, Miss Aggie, and Joe, the Navy for a time was able to read at least some Imperial Navy messages. Now, Miss Aggie went on to become one of the Navy's legendary cryptanalysts and trainers. Joe went to Japan, recognizing his obvious talents in naval intelligence. ONI, Naval Intelligence, in 1929, ordered Rochefort to Tokyo to study the Japanese language, familiarize himself with the culture of the people and their language, learn their ways, and he did just that. His training in cryptology and Japanese paid off in the spring of 1941 when his old boss, Lawrence Safford, made him an intriguing offer. Safford ran an organization called Op-20G, which was part of naval communications. Op-20G did many things. It directed the interception, decryption, and translation of foreign naval messages. In the case of the Imperial Navy, that work was done at Op-20G in Washington and at 2 field stations. One near Manila called Station Cast. It would later be evacuated to Melbourne, and another at Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor unit would later gain fame as Station Hypo. With war looking more likely in the Far East, Safford prevailed upon Rochefort to run Hypo. As officer in charge of Hypo, Rochefort did not personally break Imperial Navy messages, but he did direct the team that did that work. Initially, this team consisted of a small core group of about 24 officers and enlisted men And these gentlemen were a motley crew, a salty mixture of cryptanalysts, math wizards, language officers, and cryptologic mavens. By Rochefort's definition, they were odd characters, people who, in Rochefort's words, will not generally conform to accepted ideas. Rochefort meant this as a compliment. As he put it, if you desire to be a great cryptanalyst, it helps being a little bit nuts. Rochefort's odd characters did their work in a rather dismal place, a drab, windowless basement in the Navy's administration building at Pearl Harbor. The basement was fairly spacious, about the size of a large pool hall, but it was not a pleasant place to work. It was clammy and ill-ventilated. The air conditioner either didn't work at all or it whirred excessively, freezing everybody to the bone, and the men called the place the dungeon. This is the administration building, and that little structure there is the entrance to the basement and was the only way in or out of the basement. This is the stairwell leading to the basement, which they went down to every day. And this is an artist's conception of Rochefort's world, the basement. Now, no photograph exists of the basement because Rochefort wouldn't let photographers down there for security reasons. But there you have it. It gives you some idea of the setting. The only other visual idea we have of this world comes by way of Hollywood. In the 1976 movie Midway, Rochefort is portrayed by the actor Hal Holbrook as a weirdo, a loudmouth who speaks with a folksy twang, chomps on big cigars, and ambles about sloppily in a red smock. Rochefort's colleagues hated this version of their old boss. They said he wasn't like that. They remembered Rochefort as a tall, slender, aristocratic gentleman who spoke softly, smoked a pipe at his desk, and radiated a quiet, albeit slightly bemused, authority. Rochefort did, however, wear a maroon smoking jacket in the confines of his dank work area. Rochefort said he wore it out of self-defense. As he explained, it wasn't that I was eccentric or anything. It was a practical matter. It was cold down there. At first, Rochefort and his odd characters pleased their bosses in Washington. That changed after Japan's surprise raid on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Hypo's codebreakers were not blamed for that debacle, but Safford came under a cloud. He was reassigned, and a new team was put in place to run Op 20G. This was bad news for Rochefort. The first complication was that the new people running Op 20G had never heard of him. This stemmed partly from the fact that Rochefort had not been to the Naval Academy. He had come up from enlisted ranks, so he didn't have the usual network of classmates in Washington who could vouch for him whenever he got into a jam, which he did from time to time. A more fundamental problem was his leadership style. Under Safford, Rochefort had worked out a deal whereby he treated the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, First Commander Husband Kimmel, then Admiral Nimitz, as his primary client. He would report his cryptologic and radio findings first to SIGPAC headquarters at Pearl, and only secondarily to Op-20G. Well, Rochefort's new boss in Washington, Commander John Redmond, didn't like this arrangement. Redmond's background was in regular fleet communications, not cryptanalysis, but he had strong views. So did his chief assistant, Commander Joseph Wenger. Wenger had received training in cryptology. He had served as radio intelligence officer in the Far East with the Asiatic Fleet, and he would emerge eventually as the brains of Op-20G. Well, both Redmond and Wenger thought cryptology should be centralized in Washington. This would enlarge Op-20G's scope, but at the expense of its field stations. Rochefort's freedom to report directly to fleet headquarters would be imperiled by the Redmond-Wenger plan. Well, Op-20G and Hypo were now on a collision course. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Rochefort and his bosses had different views of Hypo's mission. Redmond wanted to turn Hypo into an ordinary collection agency. He wanted it to intercept Japanese naval messages, decrypt them, and send the raw material to Washington, to Op-20G, for analysis. Washington would do the thinking. Rochefort wouldn't go along with this. He thought that because of his background in cryptanalysis and the Japanese language, he was better fitted than the people of Washington to render judgment on what the Japanese intended. So he continued to report directly to fleet headquarters, secondarily to Op-20G. Over the weeks, relations between Rochefort and his superiors frayed. The two teams spatted and sparred. Yet, despite this bickering, they all did serious work. Along with station cast in Manila, later in Melbourne, they confronted a daunting task: how to break the Imperial Navy's main operational code, known as JN-25B. Ladies and gentlemen, this is JN-25B, or more precisely, a worksheet, an intercept of a Japanese message. Each one of those 5 numeral groups is a code group, and each was pulled out of the air by a Navy radio man on Oahu, listing for Japan's version of Morse code. Each group represented something different: a place, or a ship, or a plane, course of action, just about anything. In all, JN-25B consisted of 50,000 5-digit code groups. Assigning values to those groups was a gargantuan task, made harder by the fact that each group was disguised by a set of randomly selected numbers called additives. Before cryptanalysts could give a meaning to the real code group, they had to first strip away the additives. This was not easy work. Unlike Enigma, the code used by the German Army and Navy, JN-25B was not a machine encrypted code. It couldn't be decrypted by a machine, as the code breakers of Bletchley Park were able to do with Enigma. JN-25B was a manual code. Each code group had to be solved by paper and pencil, one group at a time. Well, Hypo didn't possess code-breaking machine, but it did have hardware, an exotic variety of punchers and sorters, collators, all to aid in the decoding process. These contraptions stored vast amounts of information, culled from the hundreds of intercepted messages that poured into Hypo each week. Because the workload was getting out of control and mounting enormously, Rochefort got help. He brought into Hypo's family the 20 unemployed members of the Navy band. Attached to the battleship California, now sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. These musicians took over the grueling task of transferring information from intercepts onto thousands of punch cards. And all this work did yield benefits. Gradually, stations Hypo and Cast, along with their brethren at Op 20G, started making inroads into Dunian 25B. By late April, Navy codebreakers had uncovered clues pointing to a major Japanese offensive in the Central Pacific. They agreed the attack would be big, but they didn't know where it would be. Now Station Hypo turned into a pressure cooker. To pinpoint the Imperial Navy's target, analysts started working long hours. Rochefort routinely put in 20-hour days. As one officer recalled, he left the basement only to bathe, change clothes, or to, once in a while, get a healthy meal. For weeks, the only sleep he got was on a field cot pushed in a crowded corner of the basement. Rochefort's analysts put in almost as many hours. Their challenge wasn't only breaking the Imperial Navy messages, but staying awake. All Hypo people were in the same boat. Some popped pills or availed themselves of other aids to keep awake. One such officer was Lieutenant Commander Thomas H. Dyer. Known as Tommy, he was Rochefort's #1 cryptanalyst. He was short, bespectacled, casually attired. Dyer at times resembled a mathematics professor more than a naval officer. Immersed in his work, he suffered various ailments peculiar to codebreakers, the result of sitting long hours at a desk struggling with an intractable code. To cope with this problem, Dyer took uppers and downers. As Tommy put it years later, I couldn't keep awake sitting at my desk, so my doctor gave me some benzodrine sulfate. I could take that in the morning and phenobarbital at night. They work pretty well. Week after week, Hypo's officers and men kept up this furious pace. Lieutenant Jasper Holmes, one of Hypo's analysts, described what he saw. Had I not witnessed it, I would never have believed that any group of men was capable of such sustained mental effort under such constant pressure for such a length of time. Then in mid-May, Hypo caught a break. On May 13, Hypo's radio men intercepted a transmission containing the geographic designator AF. A Japanese merchant ship in the Marshall Islands was ordered to go to Saipan in early June, pick up supplies, and proceed to AF. Rochefort made a connection. He remembered that back in March, Hypo had picked up a message from a Japanese scout plane that described a certain atoll in the Central Pacific with the designator AF. That atoll fit the description of Midway. If there were any lingering doubts about Midway as Yamamoto's target, they were dispelled shortly by a batch of intercepts that were translated by a linguist, Marine Captain Alva Red Laswell. Seen here, that's Laswell on the right, playing chess with a hypocapitalist, Lieutenant Wesley Wright, known as Ham. Laswell's translations provided more clues that pointing to Midway. Then Ham Wright, working with another linguist, Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, broke the Imperial Navy's time-date cipher. This breakthrough established the key dates for Yamamoto's thrust: June 3 for Dutch Harbor, and the Aleutians, June 4 for Midway. Roosevelt promptly informed the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Eddie Layton. By happy coincidence, Roosevelt and Layton were old friends. They had studied Japanese together in Tokyo in the early 1930s. It was through Layton that Roosevelt each day reported Hypo's radio findings to Nimitz. Layton now presented Roosevelt's Midway prediction to the Pacific Fleet commander. Once he saw the evidence, Nimitz reached the same conclusion: AF was Midway. But when Nimitz and Roosevelt on May 14 reported their findings to Washington, they ran into a buzzsaw of opposition. The Army wouldn't hear of Midway. General Marshall, General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Corps, and Secretary of War Henry Stimson, they all believed that Yamamoto intended to hit the American West Coast in retaliation for the Doolittle raid, which on April 18 had bombed Tokyo and 5 other Japanese cities, humiliating the Imperial Navy. Admiral King also had doubts about Midway. He at first thought any move against that atoll would be a sideshow, a diversion to deflect attention away from what he deemed the Imperial Navy's main target, a second attempt to occupy Port Moresby on the west coast of New Guinea. And he so informed Nimitz. Well, King and Nimitz exchanged messages for a couple of days. But on May 17, the Mercurial King did something amazing, did something he rarely did. He changed his mind. He radioed Nimitz that he now accepted his verdict on Midway, and he gave Nimitz a green light to take control of Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet and put them where he thought they should be. That should have settled matters, but it didn't. Op 20G's leaders didn't believe that AF was Midway. They told King that Hypo had committed a disastrous blunder. John Redmond and his analysts theorized that the Imperial Navy's target was more likely Samoa, or if not Samoa, Hawaii itself, anywhere but Midway. By May 19th, even Nimitz was getting nervous, and he felt he needed stronger evidence about AF and Midway, and through Layton, he so informed Roosevelt. Roosevelt convened his team, telling them, we've got to do something to prove to the world that AF is Midway. Lieutenant Jasper Holmes, who had been on the faculty, the engineering faculty at the University of Hawaii, told him that freshwater supply was a constant problem at Midway. Roosevelt and Holmes devised a plan, approved by Nimitz, in which Midway would report in plain language that an explosion at its distilling plant had imperiled its water supply. Such a message, they thought, would be picked up by the Japanese and relayed to Tokyo. AF had a water crisis. Japanese radio men did indeed take that bait. Their message to Tokyo was heard by American code breakers in Melbourne, and Melbourne passed this news to Op20G. As it turned out, Op20G was as surprised as the Japanese to hear of a water crisis at Midway. Rochefort, as was his custom, hasn't bothered to inform his bosses what he was doing. They didn't know about the water ploy. They didn't appreciate the slight. They thought Washington was supposed to do the thinking. But after reading the Japanese bulletin, both Op20G and the Army had no choice but to accept Hypo's Midway estimate. The case was closed. Nimitz now proceeded with his plan to surprise the Japanese striking force, which, as we all know, he did. In the aftermath of that stunning victory, Rochefort should have been the man of the hour. He was in the eyes of Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz credited him, in part, for the Midway success and recommended him for a Distinguished Service Medal. Admiral King vetoed that medal on the advice of Rochefort's bosses at Op20G. Medal or no medal, Rochefort and his team put their stamp on the Battle of Midway. The amazing precision of the intelligence available to Nimitz, the enemy's objective, his strength, the timing of his attack, the direction of his approach, his launch position was the product of cryptanalysis. But this does not mean, however, that American victory at Midway was preordained, the inevitable result of code breaking. Military historian John Keegan has pointed out one of the important truths about the role of intelligence in warfare. That however good the intel may be before a campaign, the outcome will always be decided by a fight. And in a fight, determination is paramount, and perhaps the paramount factor. On June 4, 1942, the officers and men of the American Navy won the fight. Rochefort, in due course, did get his medal. It was approved by Navy Secretary John Lehman after many years of campaigning by several officers from Hypo. It came through. Thus, on May 30, 1986, in a White House ceremony, President Reagan awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal. Rochefort couldn't be there himself because he had died 10 years earlier. So Reagan presented the medal to his two children, his daughter, Janet Rochefort Ellerding, and his son, Colonel Joseph Rochefort Jr., U.S. Army retired, now deceased. In his remarks, Reagan rightly emphasized Rochefort's role at Midway. Most of the people I talked to in gathering material for my biography of Rochefort, Joe Rochefort's War, these were Navy people and historians and veterans of Station Hypo. They all thought that Rochefort deserved his medal. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for that terrific portrayal. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Carlson? Sir.
Elliot, I hear you're working on kind of an aftermath to the code-breaking story of Midway that involved episodes back in the U.S. Can you comment on that for a minute?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm putting the finishing touches on a sequel, not precisely a sequel, but it's a book about, what I guess I'll call it a Navy scandal, or a brouhaha, or a dust-up involving the possible release or leaking that America had, or American Navy had broken the Japanese code. 3 days after Midway, the Chicago Tribune ran a front page story called "Navy Had Advanced Knowledge of Attack on Midway." A shocking headline, and the story contained very precise information that was almost exactly what Nimitz had put in the message to his fleet about the order of battle of the Imperial Navy converging on Midway. And when that story appeared, the Navy Department blew up, the White House blew up. They thought there had been a really dastardly leak. And the story was written by a Tribune correspondent who had been on the Lexington carrier during the Battle of the Coral Sea and was rescued and transferred back to the States on a troop ship with a bunch of officers from Lexington who had received Nimitz's message. The question was, how did Stanley Johnson get that message? The other question would be, why didn't the grand jury indict him for violation of the Espionage Act? And did the Japanese ever see or learn of that story and ever suspect that their code had been broken? You have to stay tuned for that.
Any other questions? Well, Mr. Carlson, thanks for a terrific book. Look forward to is that a prequel, or I guess it's kind of another story, right? Okay, terrific. We'll look forward to that, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Yeah. I would, before we wrap it up, just quickly want to point out two things. First of all, sir, I'm glad that you pointed out that while we talked about this narrative thread, and we talked about the contribution of code breaking and other factors in this battle, at the end, just like Mr. Keegan said, it does come down to a fight. And in this fight, while everybody played a part, certainly first among equals in that was the role of naval aviation, as they were really getting their wings underneath them. And so I think it's proper to point out that this is just an amazing milestone in naval warfare, but particularly amazing milestone in naval aviation. And so for all the naval aviators here, let's give them a round of applause for carrying on that tradition. Second, as I look around the room, another terrific aspect of this night is that while we do have the privilege of having Midway veterans amongst us, we also have the privilege of having young sailors and officers and midshipmen and all of those folks who are inheriting this legacy. And so even as we recount the gallantry, the bravery, the perseverance, the dedication of all of those who fought on that day in June 4th, 73 years ago, this is the legacy, this is the Navy that you are inheriting, and it is terrific to have you here tonight to join and gather that in and go and take this Navy forward into the future. So for all of those young people who are inheriting tonight, let's give them a round of applause as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our Master of Ceremonies, Admiral Rob. Thank you.
All right, doesn't get any better than that. I took my book. So it's a great it's a great event, and in appreciation, Elliot, I'd like to give you this pen as a token of our appreciations from the USS Constitution. It's a piece of the old Ironsides. So if you will prepare your glasses, the last event we do tonight, charge your glasses if you will. Please rise and we'll do 6 formal toasts that will end this evening's program. These toasts will be offered by pre-designated individuals in the crowd in a time-honored tradition. And I will lead. First, I propose a toast to the brave warriors who won victory at the Battle of Midway. Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
I propose a toast to the brave warriors who stand the watch today around the world.
Hear, hear. Hear.
I propose a toast to the Commander-in-Chief.
Hear, hear.
I propose a toast to the United States Army Air Forces.
On behalf of the senior Marine President, General Anderson, Marines everywhere appreciate the valor of our fighting sailors and brothers and sisters who won by inches, and we would like to also propose remembrance of the Marines who had the honor of fighting alongside them, and propose a toast in the tradition of the Marine Corps, its final toast. Long live the United States and success to the Marines.
Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, on this anniversary of the greatest naval battle in the history of the world, I would like to propose a toast to the greatest Navy in the history of the world, the United States Navy.
Hear, hear. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Chaplain Steiner will now offer the benediction.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, strong to save, you have granted us the favor of living in the United States of America. Remind us to never take the blessings of liberty for granted. Eternal Father, strong to save, you have blessed us with a democratic form of government. Keep us mindful of those who have pledged their allegiance to and died defending the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Eternal Father, strong to save, you have blessed our nation with prosperity and protected our nation through adversity. Inspire us this day to reflect on our blessings. Ignite in us a fervor to pursue that which is good, noble, and true. Induce us to follow the example of the brave souls who have gone before us. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the 2015 Battle of Midway dinner. We hope you enjoyed the event and will join us next year on the 4th of June, 2016, here at the Army-Navy Country Club. Thanks again for coming.